Started not long after dark. There was no thunder or lightning to announce it, nor any wind whatsoever. The first drops weren't much more than a spitting business, as if Mother Nature was still deciding whether or not to make the effort at all. Then it started coming down with more purpose, and by the time everybody knew that it had settled in for the night, the cakey dust that had swirled around and made a nuisance of itself all afternoon lay down like an exhausted pup, and the ground turned slowly into mud. People who lived nearby went home and came back with blankets and raincoats. Umbrellas sprouted up in the crowd like so many mushrooms, and onlookers kept their quiet vigil while the search continued for bodies. With the exception of a few survivors who might still be buried under debris, all the injured had now been tended to on site, or either sent home or with their parents or transported to hospitals. Now the mission had shifted from search and rescue to the removal of bodies, some of which were burned so deeply or buried so deeply under heavy sections of the building that it would be hours before all were found. The ruined parts of the three rear extensions of the building loomed like fortresses over the frantic activity of the workers, the mass of onlookers, and the growing crowd of new arrivals. One of the new arrivals was a young reporter on one of his first assignments named Walter Cronkite, who had just arrived from Dallas with his UPI bureau chief. The cub reporter hadn't known what to expect during the several-hour drive. There was no radio in the car, so all he and his companion had to go on was the brief initial report that had come over the wire. The chief had stopped at his favorite bootlegger's to refill his pocket flask on the outskirts of Dallas, and when they'd watched the low clouds roll in as the sun set behind them, they didn't get any real insight into the magnitude of the story they were rushing to cover until they passed a funeral home in downtown Tyler and watched men unloading bodies from hearses and ambulances and the backs of pickup trucks as close to the establishment as they could get. For the remaining 25 miles of their journey, they drove straight for the abundance of light from the flood lamps and the stadium, like pilots locked in on a radio signal. In New London, the chief figured out quickly that he wouldn't be able to find a parking place within at least a couple of miles of the school. So he drove until a state trooper waved him to a stop, and he told Cronkite to hop out and go to work. As he put the car in reverse, he rolled down the window and called out that they'd catch each other later, but go ahead and try to find a telephone or a telegraph office so he could file a report. When Cronkite leaned in out of the rain and asked where he should look for a telephone, the chief asked him how the hell he should know. He slammed the car into reverse and called out over the whirring engine that he'd been in this metropolis exactly as long as he had. Cronkite, lean to the point of being skinny, and in his very early 20s, had no trouble sprinting the several hundred yards through mud and rain to where the lights were brightest and the activity the most frantic. The only description he could ever be able to come up with for what he found there was that the countless workers were moving up and down the mounds of debris like a gigantic swarm of ants. He would go on in his long career to describe battlefields and race riots, moon landings, and assassinations. He would go on to become everybody's Uncle Walter, the kind, wise pillar of calm in any conceivable storm, and that would hold his loyal audience's hands through many a dark night. But on this night, a rainy March night in a tiny East Texas town in 1937, he was a gangly young fellow barely out of his teens who hadn't seen much of the world at all. And nothing in the part he had seen even came close to preparing him for the horror that lay before him, which very nearly took his breath away. Thank you.